Hello, I'm Dr. Sam and this is Dr. Sam's Health. And today I would like to talk about the nutritional research. Canada has just released our newest nutritional guidelines, which are obviously based on two things, expert consensus, as well as a systematic review of all existing nutritional literature. I do my research every time I'm preparing a blog or YouTube video. And I definitely couldn't help noticing that in many instances, number of research projects contradict each other. One day saturated fat is bad, the other day saturated fat is okay. One day eating more than one egg a day is a terrible thing for you. Then I see a meta-analysis that shows that you can eat up to 20 eggs a day and nothing is going to happen to you. Then I see a study in the Lancet showing that there is an association between red meat consumption and cancer. There is an association between use of sweeteners and obesity, and so on and so on and so on. In many cases, it's very difficult to understand how come that all these researchers doing these studies coming up with such a variety of different results, and it's very difficult to build your own system of understanding of what's going on in research and in real life. But I'm a researcher myself, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I can tell you that the main reason why the whole picture seems so complicated and complex, and there are so many unanswered questions or contradictory answers, is very simple. Majority of these studies are very flawed, and today I would like to talk about the problems that are associated with the nutritional research. I would like to start with a description of an ideal, perfect nutritional study. So, for example, we want to see how specific diets or nutritional approaches affect a person's current clinical condition, as well as their chances to develop cancer or heart attack or stroke. The ideal study would be a clinical trial, a randomized controlled clinical trial, which simply means that we'll take a large group of people, and I'll explain specifically why we need a large group of people. We'll take this group of people and we'll randomly assign them to different treatments. One would be, say, standard diet, another one would be like vegetarian diet, the third one would be ketogenic diet, and so on and so on and so on. Really depends on what you want to study. Ideally, we would like to blind them, meaning that they would not know what kind of condition they're assigned to, and it would provide them with some sort of rations that would be containing exactly the nutrients that we are prescribing to them, but they wouldn't know which ration they are taking. Obviously, this is almost impossible to do, but theoretically it is possible, and we're talking about the ideal study anyways, right? The reason why we would need a large group of people, and the reason why we would need to monitor them for many, many years, if not decades, is that the conditions, the outcomes that we are looking for are fortunately very rare. Something like occurrence of cancer, heart attack, stroke. It would take a large group of people monitored over a long period of time to actually see sufficient number of events in each group so that we could compare these groups. This kind of ideal study would be just perfect to establish causal relationship between certain diets, certain nutritional intakes, and specific outcomes. And pretty much this is the only way of doing it properly. As you can see, such a robust design is quite unrealistic. First of all, most likely it would cost tens of millions of dollars to run this kind of study. Also take many years, if not decades, to gather the information. Also, it would be very difficult to make people stick to this diet, if not unethical. For example, if someone is going on a vegetarian diet and they love their meat, it would be very difficult to deprive them of meat for multiple decades. And now let's talk about these elements that are unrealistic and how we are trying to overcome them. First of all, I already mentioned the blinding part. It's absolutely unrealistic. In order to blind people to a specific diet, it would take a huge effort, likely would need a special lab of food chemists who would design these rations that would taste exactly the same, and people would be taking them for a certain period of time. Also, it would be almost impossible to have it for a longer period of time. So the blinding is not an option at all. Now let's talk about the clinical trial part. Actually, we do have some clinical trials that investigate the effects of specific diets on certain parameters, health parameters. These studies are very costly because running a clinical trial is a very robust, rigorous process. Accordingly, these clinical trials usually involve a relatively small number of participants, and they cannot run forever. They might run for several months, sometimes up to a year or even 2, but that's pretty much it. As a result, all we can take from these studies is the short-term effects of specific diets, which by the way is a lot and it's a very important information. But again, the major limitation of these clinical trials is that they have a small cohort of patients and short period of observation. Accordingly, rare events such as cancer, stroke, mortality, death in general, are almost not happening during this period of time. So for example, if you have a group of 50 people and you are observing them for a year, you do not really expect that one of them will die or one of them will have a heart attack on a very specific diet. And even if something like that happens to one person, this information is pretty much useless because we do not really work with singular events. We want to have a large number of person years and relatively decent number of events so we could compare them between several groups. As a side note, in my next video I will make an actual review of one of these clinical trials and I'll show you what problems people are facing when they're running this kind of clinical trial and what were the outcomes and how we can interpret this kind of designs. Okay, we're done with clinical trials. What are other types of nutritional research? The other types are observational studies, either cohort or case-control studies that involve large numbers of people who have been followed prospectively, preferably, or retrospectively for many, many years. The problem with this kind of design is, first of all, they are observational, meaning there is no random assignment to specific study cohorts. Sometimes they only have one cohort in general, and accordingly there are a number of confounders, meaning that, for example, someone who is consuming lots of red meat might be a person who doesn't care about their doctor's advice, they don't care about their nutrition, they also smoke, they do not exercise a lot. Or, for example, someone who is very health aware and having a higher socioeconomic status and tend to talk to their doctor, they would consume less meat, but they will also smoke less, they will also would be less likely to consume large quantities of alcohol, they will likely be more prone to exercise, and in general, we will never be sure whether the outcomes of the study, such as like adverse cardiovascular events, stroke, cancer, incidents, accidents, anything, will be related to the red meat consumption, for example, in this case, or the confounders, such as smoking, drinking, consuming of glucose, and many, many others. Additionally, since these studies are very, very large, they cannot be very rigorous, very robust. So usually there is a huge chance of recall bias. Usually what they're doing is they're collecting information on nutrition using something that is called food frequency questionnaires, which is simply a table that lists different types of foods and how frequently people are consuming certain portions of certain foods. In my opinion, this approach is very difficult to rely upon, though they use it quite frequently. To give you an example, one of the questions in this food frequency questionnaire would be, how many portions of green leafy vegetables did you have in the past week? Can you answer this question? I cannot. What about in the past 3 months? What is your average consumption? You do not really know how to answer this question in many cases, unless you are really health aware and you are keeping very precise track of your macronutrients and the foods that you're taking in. It's very difficult to answer this question and many of these questions precisely. So these food frequency questionnaires are inherently very vague and very inaccurate. The other problem is that in many cases, these food frequency questionnaires, they're not administered regularly. Sometimes they are administered just once or twice. In many cases, these nutritional studies, they are based on some pre-existing cohorts of people. And it just happens that these people were administered these food frequency questionnaires at some point in the very beginning and baseline of the research. There was recently a very sensational study published in The Lancet. I don't want to name it, but the whole idea was that the mortality was highly associated with low-carb diets. And if you look into this study, first of all, they amalgamated 2 or 3 studies, large prospective cohort studies, in one big research project. And second thing is that they only administered these food frequency questionnaires, I think, twice. In the very beginning, then 3 years later, and then they followed these people for many, many years. And as you can imagine, over the course of this many years, people's nutritional habits, food intake might have changed drastically. It might have changed like over the course of several months, let alone years or decades. So this approach in general is very inaccurate and not really reliable. So in the end of the day, we have pretty much two groups of studies. Predominantly, these are large prospective or retrospective cohort studies that unfortunately use very inaccurate or unreliable data collection methods. But the good thing is that they last for long periods of time. They involve large groups of people. But due to confounding and absence of randomization, the data that we receive from these studies, they should be interpreted very, very carefully. And we could never actually infer causality unless the effect sizes are super, super high there. The other category is clinical trials. And there are not too many of them. They're usually very short. They usually have small cohorts of patients. And because of that, we cannot really get information in terms of long-term effects and information on relatively rare events such as strokes, heart attacks, death, and so on. But they provide us with some good data on short-term effects of specific diets. Having said that, the point of my whole discourse today is to make sure that everyone who watches my video understands that nutritional research is very flawed. There are lots of good studies, but they have some inherent problems with them. And every time you see in the news that factor X is associated with problem Y, be careful. Do not just rely on the news anchor. If you are really interested in this association between factor X and the outcome Y, something like red meat and cancer, use of sweeteners and development of obesity or type 2 or type 1 diabetes, do your own research. Spend some time, look into this study, read it, and try to understand how reliable this study information is. And can you actually base your opinion, your nutritional choices on the data from this study? As I mentioned earlier, I'm planning to make some study reviews in the future, and my next video will be about one of the clinical trials. Also have an idea on how to help you be more capable of understanding the research terminology, research design, and research data in general. I'm planning to make a series of videos on different research methods, what kind of problems are associated with them, and so on. So I'll keep you posted. In order not to miss anything, subscribe. If you like my videos, like them. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. I'm always happy to interact with you. And that was it for today. All the best.